Our guest speaker today is Dr. DeAndra Beck. She was an associate dean for research at Michigan State University, so she's local also. International studies and programs. Dr. Beck served on the CRDF Global Advisory Council and is a member of a National Academy of Sciences Committee on the Future of Science, Technology, and Innovation at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. Formerly a program director in the National Science Foundation's Office of International Science and Engineering, she worked with USAID to design and implement the Partnerships for Enhanced Engagement in Research peer program. Dr. Beck was acting managing director for environment and social assessment at the U.S. Millennium Challenge Corporation and assistant director for policy, U.S. Forest Service International Programs. Dr. Beck served as an international research administrator at the USDA Foreign Agricultural Service and was selected as a AAAS fellow at USAID. She earned a BS and PhD in biochemistry from Texas A&M University. Be my guest. Take it away.
Thank you, Nikki. I appreciate it. And I'm really glad to have a chance to talk to you all today. And Mary and Nikki and I were talking a few minutes early and I logged on about, what is the connection with climate here? And although I'm going to kind of give you a higher level overview of our foreign assistance programs as they used to be, I also feel like it's important to say right at the outset that not only through USAID, but through State Department and others, the US government was investing quite a bit in climate work globally, whether it was the UN negotiations on climate change, the Council of Parties meetings that they would have in different places, and having a US team be present at those, to more direct efforts to mitigate and anticipate some of the changes globally that were due to climate. So I was telling them there's a really multi-year or multi-decade effort called the Famine Early Warning System, or FUSENet, that AID supported again for decades, and that was monitoring rainfall, crop pests, all that kind of stuff. They would kind of give a sense, is Sudan, is Ethiopia, is, Mali, are these countries going to be stable for their food supply? So, as you all know, the climate issues touch so many aspects of food security, of agriculture, of water availability, and the population migration into areas where people are looking for resources. So it's a very complex problem that knows no borders. So I do think the international dimension is important. So I'm going to start screen sharing my presentation. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to tell you that I'm using one monitor today, and I'm not using two monitors. If I were using two monitors, I would have a notes section there that I could talk to you about. So there's a couple of slides in here that are a little dense, but because it's being recorded, and if you all want to go back for reference for any of this, you're going to have this, but don't feel obligated on these 3 or 4 slides toward the end to do a lot of reading. Just know that they're a resource for you if you're interested. I also want to invite you at any point to stop me, and if you have any questions or need clarification, I just want this to be very informal. So it's not a super structured presentation. All right, so basically, I'm just going to talk about the what, the when, and the why of foreign assistance, and the outline of what I'm going to talk about is here to give you a sense of where I'm going. The first thing is I'm just going to talk about an overview of foreign assistance. What is it? Give you a little background on it, and then I'm going to talk about the value of foreign assistance, not the ethical and moral value, but the dollar value and the resource commitment to foreign assistance. I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of foreign assistance because what's happened since January has alarmed many of us who've been in this foreign assistance world for a long time, but it is not unanticipated. So I want to talk to you about the history of how we arrived at where we are with our foreign assistance program and what the future might hold. Then I want to talk to you a little bit about the policy pros and cons of foreign assistance, because in fact there is a healthy debate about what's working, what's not working, and do we need reform. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that as well. And then you'll see some pictures, and the pictures that you will see are pictures that I've taken over the years. And I'll just do a little quick vignette about what these pictures are to give you a sense of some of the programs that are involved internationally with foreign assistance programs. And this is a picture of camel herders in Mongolia. Oh, excuse me, it's in eastern Kazakhstan. Pardon me, it's in eastern Kazakhstan, and you can see that these are the dromedary camels. They have the two humps, not one. And this family is eking out a living, so to speak, getting the camel wool and selling that for commercial use. So let me just answer kind of a basic question. What is foreign assistance? And there's another term for it in the field. The term of art for it is overseas development assistance. That's the term that professionals use in the field, but basically it's financial resources that a country is going to transfer to another as a gift, grant, or loan. And for the most part, the countries that provide foreign assistance are the more affluent countries in the world. And of course, the lower and middle income countries are the ones that often receive technical assistance. So this point about gift, grant, or loan is going to be relevant in just a little bit. You can just give the money away. What's the difference between a gift and a grant? A grant is when you give money, but you put some conditions on it and say, you have to have a proposal that I'm going to respond to, or, that you're going to have to meet milestones. So I'll give you the money, you don't have to pay it back, but there's some conditions on it. The loan is, as it says, as we know, you have to pay it back. And most of the international foreign assistance loans are very, very favorable terms. In fact, many of the multilateral development banks, like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or the African Development Bank, when they give out loans to countries, they have very low rates in terms of interest accrued for the repayment of those loans. So in addition to the monetary assistance through ODA, the foreign aid can be provided. U.S. provides a lot of food aid. We provide supplies, training and education. We provide services like humanitarian and military assistance, medical support, and infrastructure development. So it's a very large suite of activities that the U.S. government historically has provided internationally. This is a picture of a schoolyard in Ghana, in the Afron Plains. When I was working for the Millennium Challenge Corporation, crazy thing, we flew in on a helicopter and we landed in the middle of the schoolyard, and you can imagine the kids went nuts. We touched down, and it was quite a melee when we got there. So the next question is who implements foreign assistance? And typically what happens is that the federal government provides money to a lot of different actors, implementers, who implement programs internationally. Private sector has some resources that they implement. Civil society is also an actor in implementation. And this is where a lot of the nonprofits, the World Wildlife Fund, the the Center for Climate Change Policy, CCCP, World Resources Institute, et cetera, et cetera. Many of these entities will implement programs internationally. As I mentioned, there are multilateral development banks that have loans and technical assistance programs in countries, and the US government historically has given quite a bit of money to these multilateral development banks for implementation, as well as groups like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the UN agencies like the UN Food and Agriculture Organization or the Center for Biological Diversity, et cetera, et cetera. Rarely we would give money to foreign governments, but in many cases, some of the foreign assistance money went to other technical agencies like the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, the National Institutes of Health, and that money would go to these federal agencies for implementation of strategic programs. So there's quite a few motivations. Well, actually, you can boil it down to three. Why would a country provide foreign assistance? One of the first is strategic reasons is for national security, and the pictures kind of tell the story in a way. The picture to the left is the delegation of federal agency representatives who were in Egypt promoting a U.S.-Egypt Science and Technology Fund, and that opportunity for supporting Egypt was to U.S. has long supported Egypt because Egypt has helped in negotiations and helped for some of the regional stability issues that the U.S. is interested in the Middle East. The right picture is actually taken in the West Bank as it was. And the West Bank program was actually a required trilateral program between U.S., Israel, and West Bank researchers. And it's a field study looking at soil runoff. So that's an example of the kind of national security programs that the U.S. implements with foreign assistance. Another motivation is humanitarian reasons, and there are many times there are crises. We've heard of, with the Haiti earthquake or the tsunami a few years ago, or huge famine issues. The U.S. will often respond quickly and try to stabilize the situation overseas. But in addition to the short-term programs, the U.S. Has been involved in longer-term development projects. And one of the projects here that I've shown pictures of is a community fair in Guatemala that the U.S. Agency for International Development funded Michigan State University to run a project called Mas Frijol. And this project was looking at black bean genetics to improve crop production and nutrition for local folks in Guatemala. And this was a community fair to introduce new varieties of beans and also to talk to people about, just don't sell all of your beans, which are good for the market, feed them to your children too. And so this is a picture of that effort. And that's an example of a long-term development project. The third basket of interest for foreign assistance is that many countries do this for economic reasons. And the concept here is that if we support economic growth internationally, then we will have good trading partners. And so the efforts to support economic growth, we can invest in infrastructure, we can promote good governance, we can help with trade regimes, et cetera. And when I worked at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, this project on the left was an example of the major highway that went through the capital city, Accra, in Ghana. And as you can see, it's absolute chaos. I mean, we would never have a highway that looked like that with all the vehicles and the people and craziness. So the project was to improve this highway, to make it, safe and dedicated for vehicular traffic, not pedestrian traffic, et cetera. And the motivation for this was to enhance pineapple production in Ghana, which they have a lot of production, but what happens is that they lose pineapple. The pineapples rot, they don't get to port, the storage facilities are not good, and the roads are bad. So it takes too long, and the women on the right are packing pineapples at the packing plant. So that was the motivation. Where do those pineapples go? They go to Europe, and it kind of gets a lot of revenue from its fruit production. So people want to know, like, how much do we give? And if in the uh, numbers, if you ask kind of the average American on the street, so to speak, how much money do we give? People are, oh, we give 10% of our budget away to other countries, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the reality is very, very different than that. So, uh, this is overseas development assistance as a percentage of gross national income. And this is an OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development graph. It stops in 2023 because the Trump administration did not report the 2024 numbers. So I don't have anything more current for you. But in fact, gross national income, it is the income that the citizens of a country make, whereas gross national product is the value of goods and services. So the gross national income is really like how much of my dollar is going to go into overseas development assistance. And if you could see on this graph at the very bottom, the United States trails every other developed country. We give about a little 0.27% of our gross national income. 0.27% goes to foreign assistance up until 2023. The Nordic states, Norway and Sweden, have always given an awful lot. They don't do much on the military realms, and the US does. So, many administrations have justified our low giving because we do a lot in terms of military support. But those tend to be the Republican administrations who take that position. So that's what the US gives related to other countries. But if you look at what it is a portion of our federal budget. So what is that 0.2% gross national income in foreign assistance? What does that relate to? That's about 1.17% of the federal budget, 1%. And the interesting graph on the right is these are foreign aid disbursements as a share of total federal expenses by fiscal year. So you can see that it's kind of varied a bit, but it's really kind of held steady at about the 1.17% over time. And the interesting thing that's important to know, out of the roughly $72 billion of foreign assistance that is provided up until 2023 and through 2024, 29 billion of that are direct cash payments. These are like when I talked about the three ways of giving: the gift, the grant, the loan. These are gifts, so to speak. So they're given straight to the countries. So we're giving Ukraine 16.6 billion, Israel 3.3, Ethiopia 1.8, Jordan, Egypt, Afghanistan, Somalia, Nigeria, and Congo all receive funding. But what do these have in common? Why would we give that much money to these countries? And if you look at the underlying geopolitical situation in the countries, every single one of them is either is an active conflict or has a very significant challenge with respect to terrorist threats and regional instability. So this really falls into that basket of international security, which is why we give money to those specific countries. We phased out Afghanistan, Ukraine. Again, this was as of January, and so now the whole landscape has changed. So how did we get to where we are with foreign assistance and those three buckets that I talked about? Because the interesting thing is that the earliest form of foreign aid was actually military assistance. Many countries for centuries have been giving allied countries arms and personnel and things to help with conflict. But the foreign aid of the modern era kind of began in the 1700s because Prussia started subsidizing some of its allies, not just for weaponry, but for supporting these countries to keep them stable. And of course, the US, the American colonies, got foreign military aid, especially from France during the American Revolution. So we were on the receiving end at the time. This evolved, and so during the 19th and 20th century, what was kind of a military security rationale for foreign aid evolved into also an economic potential for foreign aid. And that's when the European powers started providing a lot of money to their colonies And basically it's, for example, giving, there was a lot of sugar and rum and things produced in the Caribbean. So the countries, the Europeans would invest there to make sure, they had enough people working and producing product for them. The same thing, sadly, was the slave trade in Congo and West Africa. So there was a lot of investment in the region, but it was for economic reasons, not for humanitarian reasons. So you kind of fast forward here. Now these are starting to get the dents. You don't have to read these. I'm going to summarize them for you, but it's really interesting because when we hit the 20th century and we start looking at the context of what's happening during World War II, and that was actually the pivotal time where we saw several different things happening. So before the US entered World War II, we started transferring money and equipment to our allies under a program that was called the Lend-Lease program. It was about, at the time, $50 billion. So UK benefited from that, for example, and a few other of our allies did. And we also put in 2.7 billion to the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration beginning in late 1943. And so that entity became the predecessor to the United Nations. So that was the first time. So that was a military strategic reason for investing. But then in 1944-45, as the war was drawing to a close, the international organizations like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank were founded at the Bretton Woods Conference. And so then from 48 to 52, the US gave $13 billion in aid to 18 different countries that were affected by the war under the Marshall Plan. And those largest recipients were the UK, France, and West Germany. And I would say that that initiated the humanitarian dimension of our foreign aid program. So it's fairly recent, fairly recent in history is when the US started engaging in humanitarian work. The Mutual Security Act of 51 had about 7.5 billion in foreign aid per year until 1961. So not was just the Marshall Plan, it was a continuation there. And it was at the time about 2.2% of the GDP of the US at the time. So it was a pretty substantial amount compared to 0.2. So it's tenfold higher than what we do right now. And so how did we get where we are today? So JFK, President Kennedy, established at the time it was AID, now it's AID. It was established by executive order in 1961 to consolidate a few agencies and programs that I just mentioned into one agency that had a purpose of foreign assistance provision. And until this year, AID was one of the largest development aid agencies in the world, and it was about half of all U.S. foreign assistance was given through USAID disbursements. They had field missions in about 100 countries, mainly in lesser developed countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Middle East, and Eastern Europe. And this is where I reiterate what I said at the outset. They funded programs in a number of sectors: global health, disaster relief, socioeconomic development, environmental protection, and that's where the climate portfolio was, democratic governance, and education. So looking at fiscal year 2023, aid distributed about $44 billion in aid, which was about 3 in every 5 foreign assistance dollars. Other agencies gave aid, as I mentioned, the State Department, Treasury, Health and Human Services, Millennium Challenge Corporation, and others. So aid is not the only actor, but it was the biggest actor by far in the United States. So I want to talk about just briefly the AI. Many people have looked at our foreign assistance since 1961 and said, are we accomplishing what we need to? Is the provision of all these resources, has it been effective? Is this the best way for us to make a global impact? And the Republican administration under Senator Jesse Helms' leadership during the Clinton administration wanted to merge several different agencies: U.S. Information Agency, Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and USAID. And he wanted to put it into the State Department. And that proposition from Congress really had a lot of extensive discussions in and between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So it was not a unilateral thing, it was a conversation. So ultimately, that resulted in the two other agencies going into the State Department, but that law that was passed in 1998 established USAID as an independent agency that has a dotted reporting line to the Secretary of State. So the lawsuits that are underway right now about the dissolution of USAID are hearkening back to this law that was passed in 1998 that had statutory requirements. So this is a battle between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And of course, the judicial branch is going to weigh in on what's going on. The other thing, so even more recently than that, in 2017, there was a bipartisan effort under the Modernizing Foreign Assistance initiative. They developed, it was a bipartisan effort, and they developed a consensus report that looked at whether AID should be merged into state and found that, while AID should really have some reform, the diplomatic and the development, international development functions should absolutely be separate and distinct and institutionally separated. And so the report that the committee rather that produced the report was actually had two USAID administrators. One was Democratic, one was Republican, and they said don't do it. And they referenced the fact that this has been done in Europe and it was not very effective in terms of what happened was that the portfolio of activities when other countries merged their foreign assistance agencies into their ministries of foreign affairs, that they completely lost both expertise and resources going into international development. So that was one of the motivating factors for not doing it. Okay, I'm going to go into the pros and cons just really quick. Let me just take a little bit of a break right now and see if anybody has any questions or comments or things kind of about the background and the history of the U.S. Foreign Assistance Program. I will actually stop share for a second here too and just see if anybody has a question before we talk about pros and cons, which is not a very long discussion. Yes, Anne?
I just wanted to say I was a volunteer in Vietnam and in the early 60s, and USAID was formerly known as USOM, United States Overseas Mission. So the program of foreign assistance goes way back to World War II, and a lot of the early work right after World War II was done by refugee groups who religious groups such as the Mennonites, the Brethren, the Church World Service, the American Friends Service Committee, working with refugees at post-World War in Europe.
Oh, that's interesting. And yeah, and it reminds me of a late friend of mine was 14 years old, and he got on a ship right after the war to go to Poland. It was through a church organization to provide food and livestock in Poland, and they landed at the port of Gdansk. But he told stories about they had to navigate all the mines, that there were,
Yeah.
that were laid to thwart, during the war. And so it was quite a harrowing trip, but his whole life was spent working at USAID on water and sanitary health. So he was committed from an early time to do that.
Mhm.
Okay, let me go back to continue the presentation, and then I do have some questions for you all to consider when we get to the end. Let's start the presentation. Oh, I should have advanced slides, but yeah, here we go. Okay, so foreign aid has always been controversial, and it's not controversial only in the United States, it's controversial globally, among all the nations that provide foreign assistance. And So I'm going to talk about the pros and cons. So there's as we can imagine, there's a proponents of the foreign aid argue that it can promote peace and security. We can promote democracy and economic growth, food security, environmental protection, and societal benefit. And interestingly, some foreign aid provides U.S. benefits. So the Moss-Free Hole project that I mentioned to you earlier that the Michigan State University was involved in, they were developing new black bean varieties in cooperation with their Guatemalan research colleagues. And some of the varieties that were developed under that program were actually deployed to Michigan bean farmers. And the U.S. And the Michigan bean farmers now have a huge export market in Mexico because the Mexicans love the Michigan black beans. And so there's a pretty significant economic benefit to the state of Michigan, from this Moss-Free Hole project. So it's kind of a win-win situation. Um, as I mentioned earlier with this famine early warning network system, it would always help for the U.S. Department of Agriculture to know where there was going to be significant food insecurity and that they could position commodity purchases from U.S. farmers to be sent over grain, wheat, whatever, to be sent to countries where they knew was going to be famine. So, that was a commercial economic benefit to our agricultural community. The other dimension about what is positive about technical and humanitarian assistance is that you can consider them to be soft power tools that build goodwill, improve lives, and enhance the stability of countries around the world. And I kind of use a colloquial kind of example about this that, you have a new neighbor that moves in on down the street who has a gorgeous speedboat, and you really want to go out on that speedboat. And so what do? You take the neighbor like a box of cookies or a 6-pack of beer and try to get to know them, right? And then hope that they're going to invite you out on the speedboat. It's the same thing that, it's a social interaction that, we generate goodwill and through these soft power tools so that when we need countries that they recognize that we're committed to them and have also some of their interests at heart, not just our own interests at heart. The pictures to the right here are taken in Mongolia and the capital city of Ulaanbaatar. And you can see the little girl next to their wood stoves. And Mongolia traditionally has been a herding country, and they would take their yurts, the wool round dwelling structures, and they would take them out with their yaks and other animals to the countryside in the spring, and then they would come back in the winter closer to urban areas. But with the development of Ulaanbaatar, there was a lot of economic potential in the country, so people were starting to live in Ulaanbaatar in these yurts around the suburbs, if you will, of the city. And everybody was burning those peat stoves. They were digging up peat and burning it. And the air pollution was so bad in Ulaanbaatar that one of the projects was looking to mitigate, to look at alternative ways of cooking and heating these yurts in the city. So that's an example of one project. So if you talk to the recipients of foreign assistance, so these are the developing countries, many countries view foreign aid suspiciously because they really feel like it's that soft power thing. It's like the neighbor, you come over with a 6-pack and he's like, I know why you're here, you're here because you want to go out on my boat, right? So they're really suspicious and they think it's only a tool of influence of donor countries. And many of the critics assert that foreign aid's been dominated by corporate interests and has placed an unreasonable debt burden on developing countries, especially in the big multilateral loan programs. And that these big loans have forced countries to avoid using strategies to protect their economies from the open market because they're having to comply with the terms and conditions of those loans. So many are critical of the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank got a lot of criticism too, as being insensitive to local needs, and approving projects that were not in the long-term interest of the country. So the World Bank has really pivoted and actually has a much better reputation these days than it did back in the 70s and 80s. And then finally, on this point, a lot of critics of aid kind of stress the continued importance of political considerations over the developmental ones. So they talk about these are the recipient countries, not the people within our country, but they're saying that politics rules more, and it's more about the fight against terrorism or the increase in aid to countries that maybe have been allied with the U.S. who are really not good actors. If they don't have a commitment to democracy or human rights, the fact the U.S. is supporting them has been frustrating to countries who are trying to do the right thing. So that's a lot of the critique from people who receive foreign assistance, the countries that receive foreign assistance. Within the donor countries, there are also concerns about foreign aid, and people have looked at, for example, the fact that the U.S. has put quite a bit, billions of dollars of foreign assistance programs into sub-Saharan Africa, and the countries remain mired in poverty, corruption, and civil war. And so the question is, what on the heck, what are you doing? What is all this money gone for? To show we don't see anything to show for it. And as I mentioned earlier, people have a very warped perception about how much money the U.S. gives in foreign assistance, and think that it's about 20% of the federal budget. And where we talked about what 1.7% is what the real number is. And then really, particularly as you if you read the Project 2025 report by the Heritage Foundation, there's a very strong position that foreign assistance is de facto a foreign policy tool, and it should be managed by the State Department only for political and economic objectives. And this concept of long-term development, the concept of humanitarian work, yada, 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 that is really minimized, if not eradicated, under many of the conservative positions, their long-held positions about USAID. So the questions that I have, and I can put these in the chat in a few minutes, that I would ask you. So, do you all think that wealthy countries, oops, what happened there? Do wealthy countries have a moral obligation to provide resources to lesser developed countries? And if you think that, what do you think the priority should be for these resources? Should it be to maintain a political and national security advantage? Do we need an economic advantage? Do we need a humanitarian assistance as a tool for enhancing the lives of people overseas? And then, do any of the concerns about foreign assistance resonate with you? So those are just some questions to reflect on. I'm going to stop sharing and see if you all have any thoughts about it, or questions about any of the things I've talked about.
If you have any questions, just raise your hand and we'll call on you. Susan.
All right. Yes. Thank you. A wonderful presentation. And it's so frustrating that so many people in this country have such a wildly inaccurate view, both of the benefits and of what proportion of our spending in this country goes to foreign aid. I served in the Peace Corps, and the Peace Corps is one of those organizations that has tried to do outreach on this, educate people. Why does the media do such a bad job with this? Are there any other things we can do so that people understand more about how limited this is compared to other developed nations, right, as a proportion of the budget, and all of the many benefits?
It's a terrific question, Susan, and I went to USAID in 1990 as a AAAS fellow, and we were we had sessions on how to have this conversation even back then. I mean, because you think about the constituents of federal programs, and if you're in the Food and Drug Administration, the general public, it's easy to tell them, we're here to keep your drugs safe, right? Environmental Protection Agency, we want to keep your water clean, your air clean, when it's a much more nuanced discussion when you talk about foreign assistance. And I think it's really hard. It's a hard sell because I've given this talk 3 times now, and almost well, I would say every talk that I gave it to, I was giving it to very educated professionals. And there were several comments during the prior talks to say, well, why are we giving money away? Why are we doing this? We have so many problems at home. Why are we doing this? And it's a heavy lift because it is a nuanced conversation for people to understand that you have to generate goodwill. And it goes back to the question I could ask you guys, do we have a moral obligation to do this? Because for decades, we did not give humanitarian assistance until World War II. That was the first time we started doing that. Do we have an obligation to do that?
Certainly for climate change, and people on this call, I think, will be in agreement on that. I mean, the U.S. is the biggest national contributor to the human-sourced greenhouse gas emissions up there, long after the science was established, and is just having such terrible effects in these developing nations that didn't cause the problem, don't have the resources to deal with it, and it's so obvious, I think. But again, that's people like us who understand that it's real and that we have been a big part of the problem and still are, for that matter.
Yeah. Others have thoughts about that.
And to me, part of the foreign aid is not it's the giving, but you also keep a finger around the world. You hear what's happening in different countries, and especially from a climate point of view, what is happening climatically that is damaging that country? Why do they need this aid? Or, why is it not serving the purpose of bringing them up, and if we don't keep our pulse, our hands on the pulse of the world, we're losing out tremendously. It is part of what I feel with the, USAID is that we have to keep our hand on the pulse of the world. Tim, you have a question?
Yes, the answer to this might be fairly obvious, but what are your thoughts about advice you might have for individuals who have resources that they would like to provide to people in need around the world in an economic sense?
Oh, that's a good question, Tim. And there are still, so let me talk about the trickle down effect, and then I'll answer your question. Let me talk about the trickle down effect of the cutting of aid funding. So harken back to that implementer slide about who implements foreign assistance programs. There's a pretty big chunk of percentage of implementation by civil society, and that civil society are nonprofits, they're universities, they're citizen groups, etc. Those local implementation groups. And the problem has been that when aid's being cut, USAID funding's been cut, then the NGOs have to cut staff. The NGOs have to release people. The universities have to release people. We have a faculty member, Dave Douches, who has a phenomenal biotech potato project in Southeast Asia, who's been funded to look at potato genetics there. And he lost like $23 million it wasn't 20, it was cumulative. MSU lost $23 million in AID funding when the agency closed. Well, what happens? The research stops, the people stop, you don't get postdocs and grad students, so they can't be trained to do all this in the future. So you've cut the supply line for that. So the way I'd answer that question, Tim, is that I would try to kind of go to the source of where your interests lie. So if your particular interest is in climate change, I would look around to find out where there's some interesting climate projects going on. If you're interested in the research angle, there's quite a few universities working on, climate change projects. Offer to put resources into faculty for faculty to continue the research programs, their global research programs. Or if there's Civil Society World Resources Institute, and you're interested in the policy side of it, or if you're interested in the implementation side, I think that you can go in according to your personal interests and start funding at the implementation stage, as opposed to, fund more directly the people who are being impacted. Is that clear? Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Mark, you have a question?
Thank you. Actually, Susan made the point that I was going to make already, which is, I think, very well stated by her. So that's climate. Obviously, we bear a responsibility, and so our development assistance is aimed at ameliorating a situation which we have helped to bring about. On the other hand, you might have a situation, I was watching how the AIDS care has been cut, and the drugs are no longer available for distressed people. The particular show I was watching last night was in Kenya. Now, we do not arguably bear any direct responsibility for the fact that AIDS exists, but we as a country, we may be in a situation where we can best deliver that assistance. It's kind of a moot point because it is being cut on, and all of these things are being cut. But on the assumption that this too shall pass, and we will get back to a situation where resources are voted by the Congress for development. My question is about, do you think that our contribution to the problem in the first place ought to be a determining factor in where we direct what aid we are able to generate in years to come?
That's a great question, Mark. And actually, there's a twofold set of comments that I'll reply to that. So I'll reply to your question first, and then I'll make a comment about the earlier part of what you mentioned. So I guess the question is, how do you prioritize aid funding? And I think some of the critics, and potentially justifiably so, have accused USAID of being spread too thin, working on too many projects, not really digging in on priorities. And in addition, those priorities really are not aligned with geopolitical interests, even though AID had this dotted reporting line to the Department of State, to the Secretary of State, that the areas maybe they chose to work in, et cetera, were not quite as, the priorities weren't quite as clear. And so I think that there should be a conversation within, probably, I would say, convened by the National Security Agency, or the National Security Advisor, not with this administration. I have no confidence in the leadership, quite frankly, the technical leadership. And I would say that there were some very good Republican administrators when I worked in Washington. There were some very good Democratic. This is such an outlier situation in this administration that I just feel all bets are off right now. But if you had a really competent National Security Agency who could sit down and say, okay, what are our emerging threats? I think we all know that climate is huge, but part and parcel of the climate discussion, so is water. Water conflicts globally they are big in the United States in the Southwest right now. I mean, water conflicts are huge, and the CIA has been looking at, for years, has been doing projected, where are the problems happening? It's around water use. And so, you look at famine, water use, and then where should we be investing? So I think that's a very legitimate question. I believe in processes. I mean, I believe in a group of talented and informed people that is a multi-sectoral group that has NGOs and corporate and government people sitting down and saying, what should our foreign affairs priorities be? And that's what we tried to do with the National Academy of Sciences panel when we looked at science. Where should AID focus in on science? So that was kind of the motivation for it. So I strongly believe in that process. The concept though for foreign assistance and how we look to the future and where should we go? I'm tremendously concerned about the loss of skill and expertise in this area. And, I don't know how we're going to resurrect that and how long it's going to take. And it could be that we emerge from this whole experience that we're going through right now with an approach that China's taking. And I can tell you, China's putting billions of dollars into lesser developed countries, but they are doing very little on humanitarian interventions. Most of their priority is economic. They have a big Belt and Road initiative where they're trying to link trade and ports and roads and they got a lot of criticism early on because when they said, okay, we'll go to South Africa, we'll build a dam so you have water supply, they brought in Chinese workers to build the dam. They did not hire local people. They also have a reputation for not respecting local environmental requirements and stuff. So the issue is the U.S. going to be more focused on political and economic interest to the detriment of the humanitarian side of it? It could be that that's what we end up doing. I don't know. I don't know how it's going to play out, frankly.
Anne?
Well, this isn't so much a question, it's just my 22 years of experience living in Southeast Asia and Bangladesh. And the best thing that happened to AID was the fact that the Peace Corps was created. I happen to have been a member of International Voluntary Services, which was started in the 50s. And Peace Corps was patterned after IVS. And the explosion of people whose lives were transformed and who went into AID from Peace Corps and from IVS, earnest young women and men who really had a desire to help foreign governments do the best they could in an area of their expertise. I just, the entire time I lived overseas, I knew AID people. I knew people working for NGOs who had been with Peace Corps. And the projects that they were doing were very successful, and they had a very good rapport with the people they worked with. I just think people don't understand that because it just wasn't publicized. And this is, to me, this whole, it's just insane, devastating what's happening to AID.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to fathom, but I would concur with you, Anne, that the Peace Corps I don't know what's going. I think they pulled the volunteers back, so I think they're trying to cut out the Peace Corps too. So
Yes.
sadly, yeah, but the program transforms so many lives, and I would say it transformed the lives of Americans as
Yeah.
much, if not more, as the people they were working with. So I think it's a tremendous program for this country where we are so isolated and we are not exposed to very many other cultures, for people to get a global perspective and to pick up a second language and to be in an environment where our wealth and our influence is not apparent and that we could potentially do something. It's a tremendous program and such a loss, for the future if we don't figure out a way to restart it, so.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me. And it was a pleasure. And I just, I think our best and most effective way to effect change is to try to restore some balance of power particularly in Congress. And so that's something that we're working on up here in our area of the woods. And I'm sure that you all have some pretty active things going on down in Kalamazoo. So, well, thank you again for having me, and appreciate it. And certainly, Nikki knows how to reach me if you guys have any follow-up questions. So, okay.
Okay.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you very much.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.